Today's guest on our Retake interview is a colleague of mine, and we've interviewed a few of them. Today it happens to be a gentleman who goes by the name of John Mullen in his personal life, but professionally you might know him as Blue. An interesting choice of color, John. I wonder why you picked that one. Today I am red, so we will be playing polar opposites here. Welcome to the show, John.
Hey, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Excited to answer some questions.
I want to ask you, why blue? Let's start off with that one. Why that color of all of them? How'd you get your name?
It's actually like completely unrelated to the color, if I remember correctly. It goes back to when I used to play MMOs primarily. There was like a random name generator in one of these MMOs, and I just ended up deleting. Like I had blue as one of the last names of the character. I don't even remember what the first name was, but I deleted that. It had the blue, and then I just took the E off.
How did you get your start as a caster? Because I mean, I always find it fascinating when people enter esports, and additionally when they enter at a different point than the game that they're currently in. You didn't start in Rainbow Six. People know you predominantly for your start in CSGO. What was it like getting into esports, and was this a deliberate decision, or did you, like many of us, just kind of fall into it?
So I didn't necessarily fall into casting. I always wanted to be a part of esports, but I don't think casting was ever like something I was like aiming at until probably around like 2013. Because I actually started doing it just out of necessity, since there was no one else doing it in a game called Guild Wars 2, which was another MMO. I did that for about like 2 years, and then after doing a small event at one of ESL's studios, I met someone who a couple months down the line was willing to offer me a chance to do a really high tier league in CSGO. At the time, if I remember correctly, it was called the ESEA ESL Pro League. That was like the old name for what is now the ESL Pro League in CSGO. And they offered me a chance to come on board to try out casting CSGO in their initial season of that. So I got a really great opportunity. I was really thankful for that. And it went really well. So I was able to boost off from there and start getting other events in the Counter-Strike community.
What was it like casting Guild Wars 2? That was a game that it existed for a while, but it seemed to kind of fly under the radar for a lot of people. Guild Wars 1 seemed to be a huge hit. I didn't really have much of a finger on the pulse of Guild Wars 2.
Yeah, Guild Wars 2, there was a lot of hype behind it in the MMO community, because ArenaNet, the developers, were pushing it for like esports and all that. They were promising all this support. It was a really interesting game to cast, because it's not necessarily similar to games like World of Warcraft. It's a little bit more active than that, primarily because there was a dodge mechanic in the game, which would let any character outright be able to counter abilities, which like you couldn't normally do in MMOs. And then on top of that, every character also had a heal, so everybody was sort of self-sufficient. And they played it in this cool, 5v5 sort of domination mode. There was 3 cap basically on the map, and then there was usually a secondary objective which you can use to get other points as well. And it had like a pretty interesting meta, because you could combine certain like elemental abilities and things like that to create other effects like healing boosts, damage boosts, and stuff like that. So it was cool, but it was ultimately like really hard to watch, because much like World of Warcraft, if you're trying to watch like a WoW match, if you don't really play the game, it's really hard to decipher what's actually happening. And I think that was the main reason why, unfortunately, it never took off as much as a lot of the people in the community would have hoped.
You go from Guild Wars 2, which you just said is very challenging to watch if you're not a fan, to going to CSGO, which probably has one of the best spectator experiences for fans and newcomers alike. How did you find that transition as a caster? Was it easy to pick up on CSGO? Were you a CSGO player prior to that, or did you learn the game after getting the casting gig?
I had played CSGO probably for about like 8 to 9 months, relatively casually, like maybe like 2-3 hours a day or something like that at max, because I was in college at the time as well. So I definitely like knew what CSGO was, and I knew how to play the game from a very general basis. But I think the best thing about casting Guild Wars 2 was that it taught me a lot about just casting in general, because that game was so chaotic. So I think by the time I went into Counter-Strike, I already had a lot of experience in how to handle very intense situations where you have to gather information quickly and be able to relay that, in speech, of course, to the viewers that are watching. And I think that translated very well to CSGO, but I still had to spend a good amount of time learning like the deeper mechanics, how it like executes smoke setups, just how utility in general, the economy system, all the game centric stuff, and how it translated to the the high tier divisions of Counter-Strike. That was the main stuff I had to learn going into that game.
How much did that help prepare you for a game like Rainbow Six? Because CSGO is widely considered by many to be the golden standard of esports casting. Some of the greatest esports talent of all time, be they hosts, analysts, color, play-by-play, etc., have walked through or grown up in CSGO. And to transfer over to Rainbow Six as you did, which is a pretty daunting task, what do you think CSGO prepared you for the best, if there was any particular thing for making the transition to Rainbow Six?
Probably just like how kind of esports works in general is honestly the best part that prepared me for, even from outside of a casting. I think it was very much the same thing, with how I went from Guild Wars to CS, going from CS to Rainbow Six. I think it was very similar to that situation where a lot of the basics of casting was already there, but thankfully I had now been in the industry for a few years as well. So going into Rainbow Six, I had a much better idea of what to expect from like a daily working perspective and what I was going to be doing and stuff like that.
What made you jump over to Rainbow Six, by the way? I mean, CSGO is a hard nut to crack. I think most people will agree with that. But what was there about Rainbow Six that drew you into the game and particularly drew you into want to cast it?
I think it was a really unique game because much like with how I kind of played Counter-Strike for a couple months before I started casting that game, it was pretty similar with Rainbow Six. I started playing it towards the beginning, like probably around like February or March of 2018, a lot more actively. I'd owned it for a while, but I hadn't looked at it much up until that point. When I started playing it, and as I played it more and more, and interestingly enough, after I talked to you at a LAN event, I came to realize kind of how unique of a competitive aspect this game had, and that it was kind of a merging of almost like 2 to 3 different genres of games. You've got like MOBA mechanics, you've got shooter mechanics on top of a bunch of other things, and that drew me into it because it was way different than any other game currently on the marketplace, and that still holds true today, I think.
Yeah, the first conversation that I think we had in person was DreamHack Austin back in the spring/early summer of, I think it was June 2018, if I recall.
Yeah, right around
there. You were there for CSGO, for the DreamHack Open, if I remember correctly. And your first event, funny enough, happened to be another DreamHack when you came out to Sweden, to Jönköping, and did DreamHack Winter with us. Now, take us through the month lead up to you getting this opportunity, because I mean, DreamHack Winter was a pretty casual event, but on the line was a 6 invitational spot. That's quite a bit of pressure for you to walk into a new scene knowing that the stakes are pretty high for the event. So what was the lead up to that like? How did you prep for that first cast?
Yeah, so I was preparing primarily by playing the game for a while, and it turns out that wasn't necessarily the best way to go about it, because pro play can oftentimes, like even from just a thematic perspective, it can be very different from just like playing casual or unranked or ranked. You know, unranked didn't even exist at the time, of course, but anyway. Thankfully, Ubisoft was very helpful in trying to prepare me for this opportunity, because they knew that I was like a little nervous going into that event. They knew that I was like very nervous about the perception the community would have of me. So they offered me a great opportunity to sit down with Ranger, who was still the coach of Rogue at the time, if I remember correctly. And he introduced me to a lot of the basic concepts for a couple of the maps, and that served as a really great jumping off point to learn kind of how your average Rainbow Six game plays out. And I use that as, like I said, like a jumping off point. And from that point forward, I kind of locked myself in my room for like 2 to 3 weeks up until the event, and just started grinding out VODs, trying to learn as much about, you know, how the game is played, but not only that, of course, but the players and their histories that were going to be at that event. Because like you said, there was a 6 invitational spot on the line, so I wanted to make sure I was giving the players justice, since there was a lot to play for at that event.
And shortly after that, you then got the opportunity to cast the US Nationals, brought in, and you were paired alongside one of our favorite Canadians, Flynn, current competitor for Mirage. And you ended up casting the finals for that. When you go from not having casted this game in any serious capacity to casting DreamHack Winter and then moving over to casting the US Nationals finals, did you ever find yourself being a harsh critic on your own abilities? Have you ever gone back and rewatched those casts to see what point you started from in this scene?
I actually haven't gone back and watched those casts too much. That's actually something I might want to do now after talking about this, because it is good to look back and sort of reflect on those sorts of things. But I never really imagined that I would be able to excel so quickly from just doing the first LAN event to doing the finals at the very next event. That was a huge honor, and I'm truly grateful to Ubisoft. Back on the criticism topic, though, I definitely was very focused on trying to make sure that I was looking for criticism at every legitimate avenue when I was first starting off, and that included both at that DreamHack and at the US Nationals final, where I was going around trying to get feedback from other casters, people at Ubisoft, and I think a couple players as well, because I really wanted to make sure I was doing justice to the game at that point, since it was such a new concept to me and such a new play style for games in general.
As somebody who's been involved in a variety of different casting scenes, because it's not even just Guild Wars, it's not even just Counter-Strike. You were also involved in a variety of different mobile games, working at an ESL for a couple of those, and VR games as well. What was the one thing that when you entered the Rainbow Six scene, and feel free to speak candidly here, what was the one thing that you assessed that the talent pool needed, or Rainbow Six as a community could have improved upon when it came to the esports / casting experience?
I think I don't necessarily know if there was anything that I was looking to bring that wasn't there. I did like to try and have a little bit more fun on the cast, as I noticed that some of the broadcasts that I was watching, things tended to be a little bit uptight from time to time. So I came in and I wanted to have a little bit of fun with that every once in a while, and I think that I've been able to do that. But other than that, like I said, I mainly just wanted to kind of come in and do the game with due diligence. I mainly just wanted to come in and do good work. Basically, that was my main goal.
As every single new bit of content comes out, there are radical changes that can happen to the game. Map pools can change, operators can change, secondary utility can change, even little things like sights and scopes and all of that, and tinkering with the shrapnel change for explosives and stuff can have profound impacts on the game. How much work do you find it takes in comparison to the other games you've casted to stay up to date on the changing trends to the meta and the game itself?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's more work than any other game. It does, probably from an outsider's perspective, it appears like you have to do a lot more kind of digging to figure out exactly what gets changed and stuff like that. But I don't necessarily know if that's true or not. I think that much like many other games, you can kind of go in and quickly get a grasp for the things that have shifted, especially when it comes to map changes and whatnot, because we get so many opportunities to cast these games, thankfully. So you're able to pretty quickly kind of move with the flow when things do change and be prepared for any sort of switch ups that end up happening in the meta. I think the other thing as well is that in Rainbow Six, compared to some other games, the changes that happen within the meta, especially at the high level, aren't always immediately apparent. They tend to happen kind of over a longer period of time when compared to other games, in my opinion. And I think that obviously makes it a little bit easier to notice those changes too, because they happen over a much more gradual period of time. So by the time that the full shift has come into play, you've normally seen 2 to 3 other teams try that shift at that point or start working with that shift already. And as a result of that, you're kind of already somewhat familiar with what's going on when something new is tried by a team that hasn't done that thing before. And that can expand to so many different topics.
Does it help working with somebody who has tangible hands-on experience as the coach of an amateur team, and as somebody who plays at a high level himself, your co-caster Stokes? Do you learn a lot from him, and do both of you kind of bounce off each other while you're watching matches, or if you're doing prep work for matches, etc.?
Yeah, it's been a very mutual learning experience, I think, between the two of us. I've always had a blast casting with Stokes. He's had no problem answering any deeper game questions that I've had, and I think as of more recently, that's really come to mesh very well, because I think we've reached a point where we've truly started to hybridize very well. I think that I've gotten a lot more comfortable with my game knowledge, and I feel confident talking at length about certain in-game subjects, where before I tended to stick a little bit more strictly to play-by-play. And the reverse is true for Stokes as well. Stokes has been able to ask me a couple things about how to approach certain casts from a play-by-play perspective, and now he as well is able to get a lot more confident in that respect and start taking over, I should say, some of the play-by-play roles within the games.
On a given day, we focus mostly on the North American League, the US division getting most of our attention, but obviously there's wall-to-wall Rainbow Six coverage now. For aspiring casters and for the audience, how important do you think it is for the regional casters to keep an eye on the other regions with which they don't cast?
I think it's pretty important, to be honest. I think that there's a lot of opportunities for newer casters to jump in and be able to cast, whether it's the national division, CL, or whatever. But I don't necessarily think you'll always get to do it in your home region. I think that there'll be plenty of opportunities for new casters to jump up, but it may be for LATAM or something like that. So I think that keeping tabs on a lot of those other regions will help you to not have to do a massive amount of research if you do get a sudden opportunity to jump in and cast a region that you may not be super familiar with. Just having that background info can do a whole lot, even if it's just very basic, even if it's just things like knowing a couple matches that teams had played recently and things like that. It adds a wealth of knowledge that someone else may not have and makes your cast that much more interesting.
Now, with all that said, and that's great advice for other people, the last question that I want to ask you is about your own growth. So I know you haven't rewatched those 2 early casts that you did, but over the last nearly 2 years, in fact, that you've been involved in this community, what for you has been the biggest single focus for improvement? And moving on, now that you're settled in with your duo of Stokes and you have a pretty normalized routine now with the North American League, what is something that you're eyeing for yourself to continue to improve upon as this league progresses?
So I think the 2 main things that I looked to focus on over the 2-year period, one was situational awareness, just because sometimes it's a little hard to grasp everything that's going on within a given moment while you're watching Rainbow Six, and that's due to some limitations with the spectator system, which that's gotten better as well, just for the record on that one. And the other one is game knowledge, just because I came in as an outsider. I came in as someone who had maybe like 30-40 hours of playtime before I casted my first live matches at DreamHack. So I very much came in knowing full stop that I had a lot to learn. That still holds true to this day. That's still the number one thing that I'm looking to improve on, as I don't think you can ever really be perfect in that respect, especially as someone who was not a pro in the past.
With that said, John, I know you don't do a lot of these interviews, but I greatly appreciate it. It's always a lot of fun sharing words with you. Thank you very much for coming on our show, and we'll see you for the upcoming qualifiers in the North American League next week.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.